A high-profile talk show takes an unexpected turn when a powerful black businesswoman faces off against a host determined to tear her down. But as tensions rise and the cameras roll, the audience is left stunned by a response so sharp, so undeniable, that it shifts the entire power dynamic in the room. What happens when arrogance meets its match? The applause hit like a wave. Loud, enthusiastic, rehearsed. That was the nature of morning talk shows. The audience wasn't just watching, they were part of the spectacle, trained to clap on command, to react on cue. It was all part of the illusion. Seated at the center of the stage, Olivia Carter crossed her legs, her tailored navy blue suit sharp against the pristine white backdrop of the Bryce Langley show. She exuded confidence, an effortless kind that wasn't forced, but earned. She had been in rooms like this before. She had navigated spaces where she wasn't expected to lead, let alone dominate. The cameras panned over her face, capturing the poised smile she had mastered over years in the corporate world. Across from her, Bryce Langley sat with the ease of a man who had never been questioned, never been challenged in a way that truly mattered. He leaned back in his chair, microphone clipped to his expensive suit, smirking slightly as he glanced at his cue cards. "Olivia," he started, drawing out her name as if they were old friends. They weren't. "You've built an impressive company. Carter Innovations is worth, what now, $500 million?" He raised a brow as if the number were too large to believe. She gave a small nod. "That's correct." He whistled low, shaking his head. "That's incredible, truly. And you started it from the ground up, no major investors, no handouts." Another nod. She could already sense where this was going. "You must be a very lucky woman." A beat. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. "Luck had little to do with it." Bryce chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, come on, Olivia. You don't think being a black woman in today's market, where corporations are practically tripping over themselves to prove how diverse and inclusive they are, gave you an advantage?" The energy in the room shifted. It was subtle, but Olivia felt it. A ripple through the audience, a tightening of shoulders, a moment of tension disguised under the guise of just asking questions. She had been here before. This wasn't new. Olivia tilted her head slightly. "You mean to tell me that being a black woman made it easier to raise capital, to land investors, to be taken seriously in tech?" She let out a soft, amused breath. "Bryce, if that were the case, we'd have more than just a handful of black women leading billion-dollar companies." The audience responded. A few murmurs, a few knowing nods, but Bryce was undeterred. "Val," he said, leaning forward now, the smirk still in place. "That's exactly my point. You're one of the few. Maybe it's because you were just given a little extra help." Olivia's fingers tapped against the armrest of her chair. "Help?" "Yes," he said, playing it casual, but his eyes gleamed. "Corporate America loves a good diversity story these days. A black woman in charge, a company thriving, it's a perfect narrative. And let's be honest, Olivia, if your company wasn't black-owned, do you think you'd get as much media attention? As many opportunities?" There it was. The play. The careful framing of success as something given, not earned. The implication that Olivia Carter was a product of a system eager to uplift her, rather than a woman who had shattered glass ceilings on her own terms. She could have let him continue. She could have waited for him to finish his carefully constructed attempt at undermining her. But she didn't. Instead, she turned slightly in her chair, facing the audience. "Let me tell you a story," she said, her voice even, smooth. "When I first started Carter Innovations, I walked into my first investor meeting fully prepared. I had the data, the business model, the projections, everything that, on paper, should have made me a strong candidate for funding." The room was quiet now, the audience leaning in. "But I noticed something interesting," she continued. "Investors would listen, they would nod, they would even praise my ideas, and then they would ask, 'So, is there a white co-founder? Someone with more experience in the industry?' A few gasps in the crowd. Bryce's smirk faltered, just slightly. Olivia kept going. I was told, to my face, that they would consider funding me if I brought on someone who understood the space better. That's what they said. Understood the space better, she chuckled, shaking her head. Never mind that I had been working in this field for a decade. Never mind that I had outperformed some of my competitors in early trials. The assumption was that I needed validation, that I needed permission. Her gaze flicked back to Bryce. So you see, when you say I was given something, I have to ask, by whom? Silence. Bryce's lips parted slightly, as if searching for a retort. He wasn't used to this. He was used to rattling people, throwing them off their rhythm, forcing them into defensive positions. Olivia, however, was completely at ease. I mean, she continued, if the system was really helping me, why did I have to work twice as hard just to get a seat at the table? Why did I have to bootstrap my company with my own savings while my white counterparts got million-dollar seed funding off an idea alone? Tell me, Bryce, where exactly is this extra help I'm supposed to be getting? The audience was no longer just watching. They were invested now. A few heads nodded. Some people shifted in their seats. The balance of power was shifting, and Bryce could feel it. He tried to recover, shaking his head with a chuckle. Olivia, I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I'm just saying that maybe, the environment we're in right now gave you a little boost. Olivia smiled. Right. The same environment where black women receive less than 1% of venture capital funding? That environment? More murmurs. Bryce's jaw tightened. She let the moment stretch. I have a question for you, Bryce, Olivia said, tilting her head. Since we're talking about advantages, how many talk show hosts do you think look like me? Bryce hesitated. Because I've noticed something interesting, she continued. Men who look like you get to stumble their way into these jobs with no real experience, no proven talent. They get to say inflammatory things, create controversy, and somehow they keep their jobs. No one ever questions whether they deserve to be there. They just belong, don't they? Now Bryce was visibly tense. But when someone like me succeeds, Olivia said, sitting back, we have to justify it. We have to explain how we got here. We have to prove over and over again that we're not just a diversity hire. She let out a soft, knowing laugh. Interesting, isn't it? The audience erupted into applause. Bryce swallowed, forced a chuckle, tried to mask the irritation creeping into his expression. The cameras captured it all. Olivia simply crossed her legs again, still smiling. This was going to be a long interview, and Bryce Langley was already losing. The energy in the studio had shifted completely. Olivia Carter was no longer just a guest. She was in control. The audience had started off as passive observers, clapping when instructed, nodding politely, but now they were engaged. They were leaning in. They were reacting to every sharp, undeniable truth Olivia laid bare. Bryce Langley, however, wasn't one to back down, not on his own show. His entire career had been built on steering conversations in his favor, twisting narratives just enough to keep himself at the center of controversy, without ever quite stepping over the line. He couldn't afford to lose control of the discussion, especially not to a black woman dismantling his rhetoric in real time. So he did what he did best. He pivoted. Well, Olivia, Bryce said, pasting on a tight-lipped smile, I see what you're saying. But let's be real here. Corporate America has been pushing diversity initiatives pretty aggressively over the last few years. And let's face it, sometimes that means that companies lower their standards just to meet quotas. A collective murmur rippled through the audience. Olivia raised an eyebrow. Lower their standards? She repeated, her tone light but sharp. Bryce spread his hands. I'm just saying. When companies prioritize race over qualifications, it can lead to hiring people who aren't necessarily the most qualified for the job. She tilted her head slightly, studying him like a puzzle she had already figured out. You seem to have a lot of confidence in this idea, Bryce. I'm curious. Have you actually seen any evidence of companies hiring unqualified black professionals at a higher rate than unqualified white ones? Bryce opened his mouth, then shut it. He wasn't used to being asked for evidence. He was used to throwing out generalized statements, letting them linger in the air, shaping perception without ever having to back them up. Well, he started, scrambling for footing. It's common knowledge that... Olivia didn't let him finish. Common knowledge? She interjected, her tone light with amusement. That's interesting, because the data I've seen tells a different story. It tells me that black professionals have to be overqualified just to get in the door, that we have to prove ourselves 10 times over while our white counterparts are given the benefit of the doubt. You know, Bryce, there's an old saying, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. Maybe that's what's really bothering people. The audience reacted immediately, a low hum of agreement, a few smattered claps. Bryce's jaw clenched, his composure slipping ever so slightly. Time for Plan B. He leaned back in his chair, adopting an air of faux casualness. All right, I can see you're passionate about this, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. So let's put it to the test. I actually had my team reach out to an expert on business leadership, someone with decades of experience in the field. He had some thoughts about your company's leadership style. Let's take a look. The large screen behind them flickered to life. The audience turned as a pre-recorded video began to play. A middle-aged white man in a gray suit appeared on the screen, sitting in an office lined with bookshelves. Olivia Carter is undoubtedly a talented entrepreneur, the man said, his voice smooth, polished. But the reality is that Carter Innovations has struggled in certain key areas of leadership. There have been reports of a lack of structure, an inability to scale effectively, and, let's be frank, challenges in keeping up with competitors who have a more traditional leadership approach. That's not to say she isn't accomplished, but let's not ignore the fact that sometimes passion and vision aren't enough. The video ended. The room was still. Bryce turned back to Olivia, a smug glint in his eyes. Now, he said, steepling his fingers, that's coming from a neutral industry expert. What do you say to that? He leaned back, fully expecting Olivia to be thrown off, to stumble, to rush to defend herself. Instead, she smiled. Bryce, she said, with the kind of patience one reserves for a child who doesn't know any better. Who was that man? Bryce blinked. What? The expert, she said, tilting her head. Who is he? Bryce let out a small, forced chuckle. He's a respected voice in business leadership. Respected by who? Olivia asked, her smile never wavering. Because I don't recognize him. And I'm pretty familiar with the major players in my industry. Bryce hesitated. He's been a consultant for major firms. Uh-huh, Olivia said, nodding. And has he ever built a company from the ground up? Has he ever run a billion-dollar business? Has he ever been in the trenches, making executive decisions, leading teams, closing deals? She let the question hang. Or is he just another guy who spent his career telling leaders how to lead without ever having to do it himself? The audience laughed. Bryce's smirk wavered. But let's pretend for a second that his opinion is worth something, Olivia continued smoothly. Even if we accept everything he just said at face value, let's break it down. He says my company lacks structure, yet we have one of the highest employee retention rates in our industry. He says we struggle to scale, yet we've expanded into 3 international markets in the last year alone. And as for keeping up with competitors, she let out a soft chuckle. Bryce, my company just closed a multi-million-dollar deal last quarter. Does that sound like a business struggling to keep up? Another ripple of laughter from the crowd. Bryce opened his mouth, closed it. And one more thing, Olivia added, her voice softer now, almost thoughtful. It's interesting how, when a black woman leads a company, we scrutinize every little thing, Every decision, every challenge is treated like proof that we don't belong. But when a white man leads and makes mistakes, it's just part of business. Funny how that works. The applause came fast and loud. Bryce's face had gone rigid, his mind working overtime to find a way to regain control. But Olivia wasn't finished. She turned slightly in her chair, addressing the audience directly. Here's what I want people to take away from this conversation. Success doesn't come from permission, it doesn't come from validation, and it definitely doesn't come from waiting for people like Bryce to acknowledge it. She smiled, warm and assured. It comes from doing the work. Period. The standing ovation came before Bryce could say another word. The cameras captured everything. The audience clapping, the social media feed exploding with reactions, the moment when the Bryce Langley show became the Olivia Carter moment. Bryce Langley sat there, watching it all unfold, and for the first time in his career, he was completely, utterly silent. Bryce Langley had built his career on control, on knowing exactly when to push, when to provoke, and when to pull back just enough to keep his audience engaged. But right now, sitting across from Olivia Carter in front of a studio audience that had completely turned against him, he had never felt more out of control. The cameras were still rolling, capturing his clenched jaw, the forced smile that had slipped entirely into something closer to irritation. His usual tactics, steering the conversation, twisting the narrative, making the guest feel small, had all backfired spectacularly. Olivia Carter had not only refused to play his game, she had rewritten the rules entirely. The standing ovation still echoed in the studio, some members of the audience pulling out their phones to record the moment, others simply clapping with a fervor that no longer felt rehearsed or prompted by cue cards. This was real. This was electric. Bryce had to say something. He couldn't just sit there like a deer in headlights. He forced out a chuckle, shaking his head as if all of this was just friendly banter. "Wow," he said, his voice slightly strained. "Well, Olivia, I can see you're definitely, what's the word, passionate about this?" Olivia smiled, crossing her legs. "I am, because this conversation isn't just about me, Bryce. It's about the thousands of black professionals, women especially, who are constantly being told they don't belong, that their success is a gift rather than something they earned. I'm not here to convince you. I don't need to. The proof is in my work, in my company, in every single person who's ever been doubted, dismissed, or told they needed to prove themselves twice as much for half the respect." More applause. Bryce could feel his own audience slipping through his fingers. He let out a breath, shifting in his seat. All right, he said, trying to inject some lightness back into his tone. "I hear you. Let's agree to disagree on some of these points, huh?" Olivia didn't even blink. "There's no disagreement. There are facts, and then there's whatever this is." A loud oof rippled through the crowd, followed by laughter. Bryce's face twitched. He glanced at the teleprompter, realizing they were nearing the end of the segment. Thank God. He forced another tight smile, tapping his cue cards against the desk. "Well, Olivia, I think we can both agree this has been an interesting conversation." She gave a small, amused nod. "I'd say so." Bryce exhaled sharply, ready to move on, ready to get out of this segment and regain control of his own show. "Well, that's all the time we have for today." But before he could wrap it up, the show's producer's voice crackled into his earpiece. "Bryce, hold off. We're getting flooded with social media reactions. The engagement numbers are through the roof. The network wants you to keep her on for the next segment." Bryce's stomach dropped. He couldn't say no. Not when engagement was everything. Not when the network was listening. Slowly, he turned back to Olivia, forcing a wider smile that barely masked his frustration. "Actually, Olivia, if you don't mind, we'd love to keep you on for a little longer. Looks like people are really enjoying this discussion." Olivia knew what was happening. She had seen this play before. The desperation, the scrambling, the thinly veiled attempt to capitalize on a moment he no longer controlled. And she wasn't about to let him off the hook. She leaned forward slightly, tilting her head. "Oh, you mean the same audience that was just nodding along with you when you implied I was handed my success?" She let the question hang, watching Bryce squirm. The audience murmured again. He let out another laugh, a little too forced this time. "Come on now, Olivia. You know how television works. We have to stir the pot a little, make things interesting. That's why you're here, isn't it?" She regarded him for a long moment, then leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "No, Bryce," she said, voice even. "I'm here because I'm qualified to be here." Another eruption of applause. Bryce's producer spoke in his ear again. "Bride, the network loves this. Keep it going." Bryce swallowed. He could feel the shift, the real power shift. This was no longer his show. This was Olivia Carter's stage now. By the time the interview ended, the Bryce Langley show had become the top trending topic across multiple platforms. But not for the reasons Bryce had intended. Clips of Olivia's responses went viral almost instantly. Twitter was flooded with posts celebrating how she had destroyed him, how she had effortlessly dismantled his arguments, how she had turned his own show into a TED Talk on systemic bias. Olivia Carter moment trended for hours. Major news outlets picked up on the discussion, replaying clips, offering analysis. Olivia's poised yet cutting responses were praised as the defining moment of the interview, while Bryce's weak attempts to regain control were widely mocked. Then came the real fallout. Sponsors. One by one, companies that had long partnered with the Bryce Langley show began issuing statements. Some were vague, mentions of reevaluating partnerships. Others were more direct, condemning the tone of the interview and distancing themselves from Bryce's remarks. In the network, Bryce sat in his dressing room after the show, staring at his phone as the network executives flooded his inbox with urgent messages. This wasn't just a controversial episode. This was a disaster. For him, anyway. For Olivia, it was a moment. She had gained millions of new supporters overnight. Interviews flooded in, companies reached out with opportunities, and most importantly, she had controlled the narrative from start to finish. She didn't need to go viral. She had made an impact. A week later, Olivia was back in her office at Carter Innovations. Her assistant entered, holding up a tablet. "You should see this," she said, setting it on the desk. Olivia glanced down. The headline read, "The Bryce Langley Show Faces Uncertain Future After Controversial Interview." She skimmed the article. It covered everything: the social media backlash, the sponsors pulling out, the network's silence as they reviewed their options. Olivia set the tablet down, a small smile playing at her lips. Her assistant hesitated. "Do you feel bad?" Olivia looked up, amused. "For what?" She shrugged. "For, ending his career?" Olivia chuckled softly. "I didn't end his career." She leaned back in her chair, thoughtful.